Hey, JJ, are you a game show guy at all?
I like game shows. I've watched the Game Show Network quite a bit in my time. Actually, I feel like no one else watches the Game Show Network, but I have. I like game shows. How about you?
Yeah. So pretty much nightly since I was a child, I've watched Wheel of Fortune, and right as we were coming out of the pandemic, I was actually cast on the show because they were looking basically for just people in the LA area, but I was never given a call date. So with the host leaving, I just want to say, from the bottom of my heart, Pat Sajak, go fight.
I'm JJ, and I've been playing in best ball leagues for years. But there are people out there who play a lot more than I do, and there are people out there who have won a lot more than I have. And I want to learn from them. This season, I'll be documenting my journey of max entering Underdog's Best Ball Mania contest. And I'll be doing so with guidance from some of the most successful best ball players on the planet. This is the year where things start to change. This is the year where I officially become a best ball bro. Welcome into another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. I'm JJ Zacharyson, and as always, I am joined, I can say as always now, by my co-host Rich Ryan. Rich, what's going on, buddy?
Yeah, I think we're at the point where it's an established at always. I'm doing great. WSOP in the rear view, fully focused on best ball, fired up some drafts. But I do have to say, off the top, because I am a transparent person, poker is a world of, you have to be truthful and outright. There's honor amongst thieves. So I must say, last week when you brought up Homeward Bound, it was right before the show. I thought you were talking about Old Yeller. So that's why I led with Trauma, and I was very confused. But of course, I've seen Homeward Bound. And that's why I also thought your take was especially hot. I'm like, the dog died. Like, JJ's going in on a dead dog here.
So here's the thing, though. There is some trauma with Homeward Bound where the family is...
Yeah, they just leave the dogs. Yeah.
Yeah. They leave the dogs, but then the dogs are gone, right? And then there's this roller coaster of they think they found the dogs, and then they didn't find the dog. Oh, I guess the cat, too. The animals. And then... the animals then arrive. But even at the end of that movie, spoiler alert from 1991, but spoiler alert, I don't know when that movie was created. When Shadow, they thought Shadow was not going to make it because he was the third of the three animals to kind of come over the hill into their backyard and sort of limp to his owner, Peter. But yeah, man, I'll double down on the take. Shadow's a moron. All right. I can't stand Shadow. That's the take.
Poor Shadow.
So how's your
Poodles?
Oh, look at that! I was gonna go with the segue. That's a way better segue. Even though he's a golden retriever. Speaking of poodles, let's talk about poodles.
The golden doodle is hot right now. The retriever mix. Yeah, Poodle fired up. I saw you Max entered. I entered about a half dozen. And JJ, you're in all my drafts. Every single one. I look and it's just Jagers has the 1.1. He's drafting top 3, golden position. But I will say, to keep it serious for the moment, I did see in the 2 that you had 1.1, one you went CMC, one you went CD. So I'm assuming why? Why do you make that decision? When do you pivot? Are you randomizing? Is there a weighted amount that you want to get CD at number 1 and not just click CMC? What's going into your thought process there?
Yeah, honestly, it just really came down to the fact that I haven't gotten many 102 slots and I needed a little bit more CD Lamb. And I know that it's likely to sort of normalize across the summer, but I still want to force it a little bit. Not only that, but when, you switch things up and you get CD Lamb 101 instead of CMC 101, you might get a slightly different build, just given the players that are available and stuff. It's not going to be that dramatic. It's only one slot, but I did go CD Lamb. I believe in one of them, or I'm assuming one of them. I didn't realize that I was in the drafts with you. So I was at my parents' place. They live a couple hours away in Raleigh. And so I was in Raleigh over the weekend, and I realized that the Poodle had spawned. And I was like, oh man, I got to max enter this because I'm not going to be able to do any fast drafts because I'm away this weekend. So, and I didn't know when I was going to be able to enter in general. So I just sat there for 5 minutes, max entering slow drafts for the Poodle. And it just so happened that you were also entering drafts at the exact same time that I was, evidently. And so now we're in some drafts together.
Yeah, and it's been going good. The one thing I'll say about just quickly about the CMC CD thing when it comes to game stacking week 17 is I found myself in spots where ADP is telling me that Ayuk or Debo are the pick, and I just get worried because it's going to be really hard to stack Niners Lions because those players are going at such a premium.
Yeah.
I understand that I'm not going to have the same amount of volume as you or others. So I'm okay in those spots. I am very much just married to GTO, Game 16, Game 17 game stacks. Because as Pat said, that's the one thing we can control, right? Is giving correlation and giving us a chance to, when those games pop, scoring the most points as possible at the most critical time. So I found myself straying a little bit away from ADP in those spots, which I'm okay with being fragile because I don't have a portfolio to manage. If I had a portfolio, of course, I can't have just like 1% exposure to Ayuk or Debo. But I'm okay personally with lower volume, being a little bit more fragile in those spots and skipping some Niners in favor of more favorable game stack opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I even think that the Dallas Philly game isn't the easiest in the world to stack either, just because, you feel like it's a slight reach with Devontae Smith into the third. I've done it plenty, so I've experienced that, but like it's weird because pre-draft, like the pre-draft drafts that we were doing, the big board drafts, Devontae Smith was easily an early 4th round pick. Like consistently, I was getting so many teams. I have so many teams because I kept getting a back half pick. I have so many AJ Brown, Jalen Hurts, Devontae Smith teams where you can sometimes get that now if you get, especially if you get like AJ Brown a little bit earlier, like maybe a spot or two earlier than ADP, and then Jalen Hurts slips, and then Devontae Smith slips maybe a tiny, tiny bit into that mid to late third. You can still get that. But it's a little bit more difficult because a lot of people, even when they don't get CeeDee Lamb, they're still getting Devontae Smith in the early third at this point. So you're not getting that piece to a CeeDee Lamb stack that frequently, or you're going to have to force it. You're never going to get AJ Brown with CeeDee Lamb, obviously. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
And then you're really relying on the tight ends for the most part, and some of these like basically the crappy, mostly the crappy Dallas running backs that might be values right now. We don't really know for sure. I'm still drafting them to some degree. I'm getting basically market, or I'm going to be at market with them. But I mean, like Saquon Barkley falls at times to the late second, but not that frequently. So there's just not that many stacking opportunities even for that game. There's more, I would say, than the 49ers Lions game like you're talking about. Like the 49ers Lions stuff, you're basically hoping that you can get one bring back for like San Francisco and then stack Lions, but then you also feel really uncomfortable reaching for Sam Laporta whenever you do something like that. That's the biggest problem with Lions stacks right now, is that from a projection standpoint, from an outlook standpoint, I don't see any real difference between Sam Laporta and the other elite tight ends, whether it's Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Trey McBride. I think you can make an argument that Dalton Kincaid maybe is a little bit overvalued, but regardless, let's just throw Kincaid in there too. I just don't think there's that dramatic of a difference between Laporta and those guys, and we've seen a gap between them to some degree through a lot of the offseason so far. So it just makes Lion stacks a little bit difficult to obtain too, unless you're really reaching, for that Laporta pick.
Yeah, tight end has obviously been a conundrum as well. Kelce Mahomes is something I've been interested in, but like you said, it's hard to stack Lions, so I've been fading Laporta. The teams where I have Josh Allen, I'm very comfortable with a naked Allen and maybe grabbing Keon Coleman later, so I don't really love spending the capital on Kincaid. So tight end has been interesting as well. You put here that, speaking of struggles, you're struggling with some of your marathon drafts. Strategy a bit difficult. Pick the right players. Definitely seems on the nose because, once again, we're not worried about those 16 and 17 game stacks. Any specifics as to the marathon and what's been troubling you?
Yeah, I think that whenever... It's funny because like I feel like previous years when I've been doing best ball drafts, I've almost been frustrated. And I think a lot of people feel the same way because I've seen it in Discord where they're like, I don't want to play a tournament format like this because I don't want to have to worry about these game stacks and stuff, right? Like I don't want to have to memorize the week 17 schedule and kind of be on top of my game while I'm drafting. I'd rather just get players that I like and make a team that way. if that's what you want to do, I would go to the marathon draft and I would draft via the marathon draft. The problem is I like now that I'm really in it and I'm, schedules memorized very easily. I had it memorized last year, but now it's just like second nature. I actually, over the weekend, was sitting with my brother and I was like, hey, tell me any team. I'll tell you who they're playing in week 17. And we just fired off. I just fired off the schedule. And so it's second nature. And I love having that purpose, if you will, while you're drafting. And it makes a lineup really come together nicely and cleanly. And you're looking at it and you're like, oh, wow, look at this correlation. Like there's an art form to it in terms of drafting these correlations and drafting these stacks. Whereas with the marathon, when you're doing that so frequently and then you just shift focus to the marathon and all you're really doing, all I've been doing, I think that there's some strategy involved in terms of like getting like division rivals because they're going to play each other twice in a season and stuff like that. But just to reiterate, the marathon is a format where you're just trying to score the most points across all 17 weeks. There's no playoff. And so, there's definitely different strategy involved, but the strategy is not nearly the same as, the game theory is not nearly the same as what you're going to get in some of these tournament, and playoff formats. Right. And so I've just had a hard time because I'm just stacking teams and trying to stack teams. But it's not always easy to just stack teams. Like it's a lot easier to say, I'm going to get Will Levis and Calvin Ridley and bring it back with Brian Thomas or something. And then maybe I'll get DeAndre Hopkins in there too, or Tajay Spears or something like that. But when I'm not having to worry about the Brian Thomas, it just doesn't look as pretty. It's just not as simple. And so, and not only that, but I think other drafters in Marathon.
That's right. That's how I was going to bring up. Other people aren't doing the same dance. When everyone's doing the pairs and triplets dance, there's kind of an understanding that this player might slip a little further because it doesn't align with the rest of their rosters. Obviously, you have some people that go rogue in drafts and just click people and drive you insane. That happens. But I feel like in this marathon, not everybody's doing the same two-step.
Yeah, exactly. And so, this is one of my biggest focuses and something that I have been focusing on recently is, I complained in one of our first episodes, if not the first episode, about the person who sniped Kirk Cousins from me when I had Drake London and Kyle Pitts. And I've been a lot less tilted over those experiences recently because I've recognized that I can build other stacks in my lineup and still have that individual stack and be fine. Obviously, if Pitts and London are going off, chances are Kirk Cousins is going off as well. But what happens if Pitts and London go off and then I have another stack, Jacksonville stack, let's say Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas, I don't know why I keep going to Jacksonville, but Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas and Christian Kirk, and I have them and they're going off. And then all of a sudden I have an even better lineup because Atlanta and Jacksonville is going off in that instance. And I have the Jacksonville quarterback just instead of the Atlanta one. So I'm thinking in that way. And the other thing too, to your point about, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because in those drafts, in those playoff drafts where stacking matters a little bit more, maybe stacking, just game stacking, we'll say, matters a little bit more. Generally speaking, people are sharp who you're drafting with. They recognize that they're working towards their own game stacks and their own stacks in general. So if you do have London and Pitts, you can definitely get a discount on Kirk Cousins because most people are not going to go after someone like Kirk Cousins when they don't have London or Pitts. And so what I've been trying to do is extract as much value as possible from those quarterbacks and not take them even at ADP. Recognize if, hey, I'm picking in 8 more picks. Maybe I'll pass on this quarterback, even though this is his ADP right now, extract a little bit more value out of running back or wide receiver. And then on the way back, hope that no one takes Kirk Cousins because I have London and Pitts and there's no reason for them to really reach for Cousins. If they do, I'll be okay, right? But in the marathon, it's just not happening that way because everyone's just taking whoever is highest on the ADP list because they're not as concerned about game stacking.
Yeah, I find myself doing that exact thing where when I enter the later rounds, I've got 2 or 3 quarterbacks that I'm fine with getting because they correlate with other receivers or perhaps even a tight end that I have on my roster. First draft I did was a fast draft for BBM. And at the later stages, I was like, okay, I've got a couple Vikings, I've got a couple Pats, I've got a couple Panthers. Happy with any of those 3 quarterbacks. Ended up getting McCarthy, which was actually a bigger stack for me because I started, I think I started with 1.3 and I took Jefferson. I went for the gamble there.
Yeah, you're like Davis Maddock.
Listen to our guy Davis, and it might have been 1.3 or 1.4. But yeah, I went for the JJ stack there because I'm very intrigued in that Vikings Packers game as well. But yeah, that's been my end game theory, and all the drafts that I've done is be comfortable with taking 2 or 3 quarterbacks at the end because they're going to piece together with something that I've done previously in the draft. You've got here, you're going live this week or a couple in the coming weeks for some from BBM drafts?
Yeah, I'm going to be doing some live streams for BBM drafts on the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel. So you guys should check that out. youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to embarrass myself throughout in front of the world as I draft these uncorrelated lineups and panic and tilt. But yeah, I'll be live. I don't know what the exact day will be each week, but I'm going to try to get into a pretty good cadence. Right now, very, very busy trying to get the draft guide all finished up. I'm not even close to it's not even close to done, and I only have 20 days until this thing launches, or 19 days by the time this episode goes out. So I'm working very, very hard on the draft guide. I want to be live and streaming as much as possible, but it won't happen that frequently until that draft guide's out. But it's really funny because speaking of being live and drafting, our friend Pete Overzet, he was drafting live yesterday and doing his live stream that he does basically each day. And I ended up just randomly joining a BBM, and I saw Overzet was in the 101 spot. And so I DM'd him, and then I was like, wait, I wonder if he's streaming right now. And he was streaming at that moment. So I actually drafted a BBM team on Pete's live stream when I was not the guest. I was just drafting with him, which was pretty fun. But hopefully you guys will be able to tune in and check out those live streams. Just check my Twitter account. I'll talk about it on the podcast and stuff as well. I might even be live on Wednesday. So I haven't figured out the schedule totally yet, and that's not really my nature to just kind of degaff it and just kind of go online whenever. But I'm hoping that there will be a cadence and I will be drafting live.
Well, make sure you subscribe to this channel if you're watching on YouTube. You get a notification when JJ is live, and to look for the bat signal when he fires those up. All right, some positional talk, and then we'll get into some specific players, because ambiguous backfields, it sounds like here, are giving you a bit of a struggle when you're looking at the RB1 at ADP, but you have a chance to maybe wait a little bit and get their running back mate a little bit later. So, JJ, how are you tackling these situations?
Yeah, let's just use the Jacksonville, Tennessee game as the example. So let's say early on, I get Christian Kirk, and then I get Brian Thomas. I'm going after a Jacksonville stack, and so I'm going to probably try to get Trevor Lawrence later. I'm going to want to bring it back to some degree with a Titans player, and I'm sitting in like round 9 or something like that, and Tony Pollard is at the top of the list, and I have, he's at ADP, basically, if I were to draft him at that point. I found myself saying, yeah, I'm going to draft this guy because obviously I want the correlation, but the interesting thing is, I think that the delta between Pollard and Tajay Spears, while it is closing a little bit via ADP, I've found that gap is just unnecessary and has been unnecessary throughout the offseason. The thing is, though, it's weird, is that I think I'm at like 12% Spears right now, and I'm at like 9 or 10% Pollard. So I'm above market with these guys, mostly because I like ambiguous backfields, and I think Tennessee's offense is just intriguing in general. But I wish that gap in exposure was different, because I think Spears is the better value, right? Like ideally, I think that I would be like 5%. I have like a 5% delta between Spears and Pollard in terms of exposure. And so the issue that I'm running into, and maybe others are running into this as well, is when you're sitting there staring at a correlated piece, like Tony Pollard in a Jacksonville stack, you're sitting there staring at it, but you know that you want Spears, but Spears might be gone by your next pick or the pick after that. What do you do? And so I'm doing my best to kind of balance that out a little bit, and maybe even reach slightly for Spears, because I do like him more as a value in general. But that's definitely been a pain point for me recently. I think that you could argue that with even like the Cincinnati backfield. Like I like Zach Moss more. It's not quite the same, because I think that Spears and Pollard could be flipped realistically. Like I think that you could draft Spears ahead of Pollard, and I wouldn't even blink. I do think that Zach Moss is a more logical pick above Chase Brown, be in that Bengals backfield. But with that being said, I do think the gap should be a little bit smaller between those two players, especially in a best ball format where Chase Brown has that big playability. So, it's similar to that where let's say I get, it's not really many Denver pieces, but let's say that I'm just getting a Cincinnati stack in general and I want another Cincinnati player. I ideally kind of want to wait on Chase Brown, but I'm forcing myself to just get Zach Moss because he's sitting there. I don't mind Zach Moss either. I don't feel as strongly about this Bengals backfield as I do the Titans backfield, but it is a situation that I think me and a lot of others are probably running into with these drafts.
Yeah, it's an interesting spot in the draft too. I'm just looking at current ADP right now. There's about 14 spots between Tajay Spears and Tony Pollard, and it's kind of a wide receiver dearth, right? Because by that point, you're looking at Samuel and Lockett off the board. And by ADP, the next 7 players are non-receivers.
Exactly.
So you're kind of in this like wasteland of quarterback tight end.
Yeah, there's not an alternative. There's not an alternative whenever you're about to pick Pollard. It's like, okay, I can wait for Spears. Let me just get, Cortland Sutton. Like, this isn't really doing it for me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm going to say the most annoying answer to this question, and it's probably draft specific, right? Because if you're looking for, let's say, Washington guys to pair with, if you took some of the Dolphins early, then you got Jaden Daniels right there for that game stack. So I think it's, to me, just looking at this area of the draft, it is just going to be dependent on what other stacks that you're targeting. But yeah, it's really interesting. And I agree that Tajay and Pollard, like if you pick one or the other at Pollard's ADP, it's not surprising. At all. Yeah. So yeah, it's just a weird spot of the draft where there's like you said, there's no obvious pivot.
Yeah. Well, there's also just a lot of ambiguous backfields this year. Like I think that James Conner is the better pick between himself and Trey Benson, but a lot of the research that I've done has shown that you generally want a rookie, younger guy in those rounds and in that area of the draft. And I probably prefer Trey Benson at cost versus James Conner at cost, at the end of the day. But there are times where I want to stack that game. I want to stack, like, let's say that I get Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua early. Like I want to force the issue at least a little bit. And so that's just, it's a pain point right now.
Yeah. And it's like the market is responding to this concept.
Yeah.
And just smushing these backs together. And this is probably why you love Charbonnet so much, because he's the outlier where every other RB combo is getting smushed together, and Zach Charbonnet is just chilling out there in the later double-digit rounds.
That's true.
Let's get into players. I just mentioned the Miami Dolphins, and Jaylen Waddle is a name that you've been clicking often. But you said you got to slow it down with Waddle.
I do. I got to slow it down with Waddle. Like, I don't like the Week 17 game. They get Cleveland, and it's a rough matchup. It could be ugly at the end of the day. That Dolphins Browns game. With that being said, I think Jaylen Waddle, amongst a lot of ambiguity in round 2, is the best round 2 pick. I talked about him in an email newsletter a couple weeks ago about how, maybe it was last week, about how Waddle and his peripherals were better than they were in 2022 versus 2023. Like he got better as a player from 2022 to 2023. It's just that touchdowns weren't necessarily on his side as much, but also, he wasn't able to stay healthy, and that was an issue for him. And so a healthy Waddle. The other thing too, and this is something that I talked to with Justin Herzig a little bit, who's the guest today. But the other thing too is Waddle does have some contingent upside. Like if Tyreek Hill goes down, Jaylen Waddle could see a 30% target share in that offense. I don't think anyone would flinch if something like that were to happen. And so
I've got a bit of a hot take here too.
What's that?
If Tyreek Hill goes full AB, then
there you go. Yeah.
Contingent upside.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, if Tyreek Hill goes full AB, then that could happen as well. So like I think that Waddle is just a very, very strong pick in general. And I don't like to have massive exposure to early round picks because obviously you're spending more capital to get those guys. And if it goes south, then that's bad for a large percentage of your teams. But I'm not going to lie. Right now, Jaylen Waddle, I've got him at like 22% exposure. And I need to slow down a little bit because I think that's too much for a second round pick. It's just that there's so many question marks in that area that I feel when I'm in the front half of the draft, I generally feel okay with going with Jaylen Waddle in round 2, and he slips to round 3 pretty often. So I like Waddle a lot right now.
Appreciate the correction on that Dolphins-Browns week 17. I've got a Bijan team that is just at the front of my mind that I absolutely love, so I'm just waiting to take Jayden.
Yeah.
So that's why I made that mistake there. Round 6 receivers, another spot that you're having a little bit of trouble with. And the fact that there's just a great amount of rookie receivers there with Ladd McConkey, Keon Coleman, and Brian Thomas. But then you've got Jordan Addison, who it seemed like you were a little bearish on in your conversation last week. How are you tackling round 6 right now, JJ?
Yeah, I think round 6 is typically a wide receiver round. You know, sometimes you'll see those round 5 running backs drop into round 6 and even deep into round 6. And I'm fine with going like Rachaad White in round 6 and when that's the case, because that's going to happen. But when you look at round 6, it's like you're choosing between rookie wide receivers. You have Ladd McConkey, Keon Coleman, Brian Thomas, Rome Odunze's in there as well. But then you have Jordan Addison, who I think is intriguing to a lot of people. Calvin Ridley at this point is usually falling off the board at like the 5-6 turn, so he's not as much of an option. And Chris Godwin's been going earlier and earlier as well. But I've taken a step back and I really wanted to analyze the round 6 wideouts. And I've realized that the guy I like the most is Brian Thomas of all of these players. Calvin Ridley aside, maybe Rome Odunze aside, because I think Odunze is really interesting from like a contingent upside standpoint and the fact that he's just such a good prospect. But Brian Thomas wasn't that much worse of a prospect according to my model compared to Rome Odunze. And I think he's in a more advantageous situation where, the biggest competition for him is Christian Kirk. Whereas obviously, Odunze is playing with a rookie quarterback, with DJ Moore, with Keenan Allen. He's going to be the number 3 option on that team at best to start the season at least. And so I think Brian Thomas could emerge and just be a legit X for Jacksonville, right? And I'm looking at him versus Ladd McConkey and Keon Coleman in particular, which is usually the decision that people have to make. And Ladd to me is probably more of a floor than ceiling guy in year 1. Like realistically, you're looking at a decent amount of volume potentially, but there's also a chance that he plays slot for them for most, or at least the front half of the season or the early parts of the season, because wide receivers just don't really matter that much in the Greg Roman offense. And they want him to be slot, kind of get acclimated. And he's not really the guy that we want him to be right away. It's range of outcomes wise, that's very possible, right? Keon Coleman wasn't nearly as good of a prospect in my eyes as Brian Thomas was, and draft capital showed that. Keon Coleman, in obviously really, really good spot in Buffalo, high-powered offense, should be a decent amount of passing volume, Josh Allen, yada, yada, yada. But, talent-wise, I prefer Brian Thomas. And so I think situationally and talent-wise, when we put that together, like Brian Thomas was a 94.5. He had a 94.5 score in the ZAP model, whereas Ladd and Keon Coleman, were in the high 80s in that model. Like Brian Thomas was the better prospect. So I'm going to lean on that a little bit more. He's been someone that I've been gobbling up a good bit. I'm probably at like 18%, maybe 17% Brian Thomas right now. I just think he's a really, really good pick right now in the 6th round.
And you're right about Chris Godwin, the 15th highest mover in ADP this week, up 2.7 spots. Let's stick at receiver real quick. You've been giving a lot of love to the Cardinals, a lot of love to the Cardinals-Rams week 17 game stack, but there's one receiver in particular, solid year 2 score of 86 that you want to show some specific love to, and that is Michael Wilson.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are in on Zay Jones being an integral piece of some sort in that Cardinals offense, which he might be. I think that they're like, he could be in their 3 wide sets. Greg Dortch could be their slot guy, but Michael Wilson to me is at least an unrealized version of Zay Jones at the very least, but he also, has more upside. Like I love Dontayvion Wicks. I've been talking about Dontayvion Wicks since January, as a buy in Dynasty. Now everyone's talking about Dontayvion Wicks. His ADP, I don't think has changed that dramatically. Like it hasn't. Do you have the number?
So he's up another 2 or 3 spots this week. He's up a full round since we started this show.
Okay. So, but even still, like, I think that he's still like gettable where he gets drafted. Like, I think that it's fine that he's up that round. I still like, I wouldn't be shocked if he makes it up closer to like where the Bills wideouts go, like the Shakir and Curtis Samuel types and maybe even like a Sutton type. Like I wouldn't be shocked, basically jumping Dobbs is the end result here with Wicks. I like Wicks straight up more than Dobbs right now. But regardless, so like I like Dontayvion Wicks. Don't get me wrong, but in my year 2 model, which projects how well a guy's going to do in year 2 and year 3, Michael Wilson and Dontayvion Wicks have almost identical scores. And Michael Wilson's walking into a situation with a good quarterback, with a general lack of competition. I would argue strongly that Dontayvion Wicks has more competition in his offense than Michael Wilson does in his. And Wilson, so I can always tell if I'm high on a guy because I look at my rankings that I've imported and uploaded onto Underdog, and then I look at ADP, and I'll see like I have Michael Wilson starred because I have a Rams Cardinals stack, and I'm waiting for him to kind of pop up the draft board so I know when to draft him. And I see him highlighted at the top of the list, but I realize it's the rankings list, and I click ADP, and he's like 20th on that list.
He's
I'm
gone.
like, oh yeah, I'm like I can wait even longer to get Michael Wilson. So he's someone that I've been drafting a lot because I do think the talent profile, I don't think he's going to have a wide receiver 1 season. I don't think he's probably going to be a wide receiver 2 ever in fantasy football. I don't even know if Dontayvion Wicks will be, but I do think a wide receiver 3 type season is in his range of outcomes.
Yeah, and Michael Wilson going in the opposite direction in terms of ADP since we started this show. He's been down 3 spots, 2 spots, going in the 15th round. So
I'm assuming
you're getting the 4-round discount.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's Zay Jones.
With the Zay Jones signing. Yeah.
Which is crazy, though. Like, I don't think that we should let a player like Zay Jones dictate a year 2 talent profile. You know what I mean? Like, of course, what I'm saying here is not that Zay Jones can't be ahead of Michael Wilson. What I'm saying here is we have to
be certain. We should not be 100% certain.
Right.
That Zay Jones is ahead of him.
Right, exactly. Zay Jones is fine. Like, he's the definition of a fine player, right? But Michael Wilson is a year 2 ascending talent, if you will, hypothetically, who has a decent year 2 score, was okay enough year 1, and I think could easily be better than Zay Jones. Why couldn't he be better than Zay Jones? So I'm going to lean into that and draft him accordingly.
One more player, then we'll get to the interview. This is a player that you've been loving on throughout the process here in the summer, but it sounds like you're getting a little bit of pushback from times that you've talked with others, and that is running back Kimani Vidal.
Yeah, like it's strange. So like I really liked Kimani Vidal as a prospect. I then talked to Matt Waldman on late round perspectives. He was really into Vidal, and that kind of just did it for me, where I'm like, okay, these numbers are saying this. Waldman's saying this. Waldman had the DeAndre Swift comp. The numbers actually gave him a loose DeAndre Swift comp. What if this guy at this smaller school, which is why he went day 3, what if this guy is kind of like a DeAndre Swift in the way that he would accumulate points in his offense, right? And so, I've seen tweets from Davis. I'm not calling Davis out here. He's a friend of mine. He sent a tweet that said there's a non-zero chance that Kimani Vidal is not even on the team this year, right? Like he's a day 3 pick. I don't think Davis's tweet is wrong by any means, which is why I'm bringing it up. So I'm not calling him out. My point though is I think logically Vidal still makes sense, even though he's this day 3 pick being drafted amongst maybe semi-stat like a Jaleel McLaughlin type, or like even Ray Davis, who went ahead of him and is maybe in a slightly better situation. But I don't know if that situation is that dramatically better at the end of the day. I mean, Vidal right now, his biggest competition is Gus Edwards, who's 29 years old and doesn't catch passes. We know factually that Gus Edwards is not a pass catcher because we have a very, very large sample size of him not being a pass catcher. His other competition is a guy coming off an Achilles injury in J.K. Dobbins, who has not been able to stay healthy throughout his entire career, and he's coming off a devastating injury, where we know that these running backs don't come back from very well, or they haven't historically, let alone the year after it happens, right? And so I'm looking at Vidal, and of course there's the downside of he's a 0, right? There's that down, and you're drafting him in like round 14-ish, and
that's why he's going in round 14 though,
I know.
Right? His risk is built into his ADP.
Yeah, I know. I think this is the thing though, where like I've listened to a lot of best ball bros and even talked to, these guys when interviewing them, and the sentiment is we should be trying to get points at every round of our draft. And you do run that risk that Vidal is a 0, but I also think that he's one of those bets where he could get steamed up into round 10 pretty easily if things like break his way even moderately, over the summer, where like the thing with Vidal, which is intriguing for me, is we want pass catchers in fantasy football. The team right now doesn't have a pass catcher, and Vidal's bread and butter is pass protection, which is exactly what we are always concerned about with rookie running backs. And he has that. He has the thing that we're looking for. He's, at the very least, to me, he's a good change of pace back in that offense. And if you're a change of pace back, you could find the field and maybe become something a little bit bigger in an offense that lacks alternatives at running back. So to me, I'm still drafting Vidal. I'm even still drafting Tyrone Tracy a little bit later, where, Eric Gray's getting a lot of steam, but I'm going back to the evaluation piece where the stuff that I'm looking at says that these guys are good pass catchers, they're explosive, and they bring something to the table that these other running backs aren't bringing to the table. And in Tyrone Tracy's case, it's two backs who don't have a good size speed combo at all and aren't necessarily great pass catchers. Tyrone Tracy is a great pass catcher and has that explosiveness. Kimani Vidal, pass catcher, has that explosiveness. Gus Edwards will be the goal line back, sure, but I just don't see why Vidal shouldn't be in the conversation with some of the other backs that go in that range. And for the record, I like the other backs that go in that range, thankfully, because it's brought down my Kimani Vidal exposure. Yeah, I'm not drafting him in every freaking draft because I like the other backs there too.
You don't have 70% exposure. Yeah, I just can't get past Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh want to cram the ball.
Yeah.
Okay. They don't care that they have Justin Herbert as their quarterback.
Yeah.
Like they want to cram the ball as much as possible. And this is an ambiguous backfield with somebody who profiles very well in that role.
Yeah.
I can't get past that.
Same. He's an undersized guy, but I do think that we could be looking at a DeAndre Swift type player from the standpoint of not him being that good of a prospect or not him even being that good of a player, but from the standpoint of how he accumulates points, right? A lot through the air, maybe at most 100 to 150 rushes on the ground if things go his way. Not necessarily even in year one. I'm just saying career-wise. But like, there's nothing wrong with that in fantasy football. Like, there's such strong correlation between pass catching running backs and success, not just in full PPR, but half PPR leagues too. So definitely, I'm still in on Kimani Vidal. Maybe when I play this back in August, I'll sound like an absolute moron, but I'm having a hard time, logically and rationally just saying, no, I'm going to fade him because he might be a 0. I think that the risk reward is at least there.
Yeah. It's round 14. Let's shoot for some upside.
Yeah. Let's
JJ, you got another champ.
I do. We have another Best Ball Mania champ who joined the show. Justin Herzig. He is a winner of Best Ball Mania. He does work for our friends over at Establish the Run. With Justin, I talked about the ambiguity of round 2, which I sort of alluded to earlier when talking about Jaylen Waddle. We talked about 0 RB, his favorite 0 RB backs, tons more. So without further ado, let's talk to Justin Herzig. This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. There's no better place to play best ball than at Underdog. There are leagues starting all the time, and you can choose whether you want to do a slow draft or a fast one when entering one of those leagues. And you don't just have to play Best Ball Mania to play best ball at Underdog. There's a wide variety of contests to choose from. You can even check out Underdog's other games as well, like Pick'em. Right now, you can get in on the action with a deposit offer and free copy of the late round draft guide just by signing up and depositing. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. When you sign up, use promo code LATEROUND and make a deposit for a deposit offer and a free copy of the late round draft guide. That guide will then be emailed to you when it launches on July 1st. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. So Justin, before we started recording, I had asked you sort of where you were at with Best Ball Mania. And I asked you strictly from a selfish perspective because I'm trying to sort of pace myself and understand like where others are at. I've talked to other folks like Liam Murphy, who is already like 50 drafts in by the time, June basically hit. But then I asked you that and you gave me an answer that was kind of surprising. So can you share that answer with the folks listening?
Yeah, so I've probably done about 1,000 or so drafts, but I've only done one best ball mania. And so the drafts that I've really been focusing on right now are the ones that are more time boxed, that they're going to close, and the information kind of gap from now to August, it doesn't exist because the contest is already closed. For me personally, and I'm not saying this is the right strategy for everyone, but I think that, hey, I live and breathe this stuff. I'm in a daily basis. I think my ability to kind of read through the noise, see what the important news is that comes out in July and August when we actually have the training camps, when we see who's running with the ones, when we see the potential usage stuff, that's where I feel I have a greater edge to actually kind of pull in the right levers to be drafting in that time period. And then also, when we think about things like combinatorial ownership, when we think about players that aren't drafted, knowing that, hey, I've got the entire best ball mania already 70, 80% has been done. We know where players stand. We know who hasn't been drafted, where they've been drafted. That's where I think I have a greater edge in the August time period. Now, I understand I'm giving up some. So like, for example, Rashee Rice, he's been, being drafted in that kind of 7th round area. If he ends up with no suspension, he's back to that 2nd rounder, 3rd rounder. And I probably lost substantial edge to people who are doing that. Or if you get another injury situation where I think it was the Cam Akers, where Darrell Henderson moves all the way up, like there's definitely downsides to not drafting this early. But for me and the way that I kind of play, the levers that I can pull, I think I have more edge come August time period. So specifically for Best Ball Mania, some of the larger contests I care the most about, I backload those as much as possible.
Yeah, look, it makes a lot of sense. I think that a lot of people are probably going to be thinking that way, because of what happened last season with, Puka Nacua, Tank Dell, where I think this time of year, people probably weren't as on those guys. But then obviously we get training camp reports, we get different things going on in July and into August, and folks were more into them as a result of that. And I would guess this is strictly non-analytical, but I would guess that there were way more Puka Nacua teams drafted in July and August last year than there were in May and June. But yeah, I mean, like the beauty with Best Ball and with Underdog in particular is that like it's not like the games and the contests that we're playing and dealing with are all summer long content. Like not every single one is spanning 4 months like Best Ball Mania. Like you said, you've still drafted 1,000 teams so far. There's plenty of other contests that you can choose from and sort of get into without having to worry about the 4 month information news dump as you are with Best Ball Mania. Let me ask you some other questions that's while looking at this landscape, this best ball landscape. Right now, to me, the 2nd round is really, really interesting because it feels like, last year, maybe even the year before, it seemed like there were some pretty solid, obvious picks in that range. This year, I think it's just a little bit more up in the air. And so my question to you, I've heard others on the show talk about this when asked, but my question to you is, has that forced you to sort of differentiate the way that you're looking at your 1st round pick to your 2nd round pick, and not going with just chalk, right? And not just going with, hey, I got Jahmyr Gibbs in round 1. Now I'm going to get Drake London in round 2. Has it forced you to look at maybe going with Jahmyr Gibbs and then maybe Nico Collins, who's usually more of a mid to 2nd round pick?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of validity to this, but for me, now is not the right time to employ it if we're talking about a contest like Best Ball Mania that's going to last all summer. Because come August, or for tournaments that are time boxed, they're closing soon, that's when I'm using it. And so previously, if it's time boxed, I'll do it. Otherwise, I'm waiting till August because consider you give the Gibbs Nico at the 1-2 turn. If you do that because you want to get unique, what if reports come out that, positive about Diggs or positive about Tank, and now Nico drops to the end of the 3rd? Now people are getting that same combo that you thought was going to be unique, but they're still getting it. And they're getting that extra player, that extra Marvin Harrison, that extra Drake London in the 2nd round. So come August, when we know when the ADP has looked like all over the summer, that's when we can be more confident in kind of the reaches to get that unique combinatorial ownership. And then on the other hand, rather at this time, I'm focusing more on kind of like, hey, are there unique or game stacks that I can get that we may not be able to get later on? So an example would be AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Jalen Hurts. That'd be the 1st round, 3rd round, 4th round. You can get those right now. It feels chalky because a lot of people are doing it, but who's to say that when we get to July and August, that combo is still going to be available? Maybe Jalen or Devontae move up. And now what we thought was chalky now ends up, it was only chalky for maybe 30% of the BBMs. And it's pretty rare to get later on, or people have to reach and do that in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd round to get it. So that's where I'm kind of letting the draft from where we are, the meta of it right now, And I'd say, hey, now is where you'd focus on that unique Eagle stack that you may not be able to get later. And come August, we can then say, hey, that Jameer and Nico combo really hasn't been drafted much this entire time. Let me attack it now.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. If you have a draft or a contest rather that you know is going to fill in 4 days, which we've seen frequently in Underdog because people are ferocious and degenerates, within that app. But if you know that a contest is going to fill, is that when you would maybe differentiate a little bit more in those first 2 rounds?
Yeah, and I mean, the way to think about it is the wide receivers that are going anywhere from, there are so many in that kind of second or third round that if you look at the projections and you were to give someone an extra 0.5% target share, that might jump them from the end of the third to the middle of the second. These margins are so small, especially in that group of wide receivers. You can compare it to DFS, where if we were to think through all of our weekly projections, maybe one player is projected for 15.9 and someone else is projected for 15.7. But there might be 10 or 12 guys in that mix. And now, if you're just looking at rankings, you're like, oh, this guy's 12 spots behind. Yeah, but if you're actually looking at projections on a weekly basis, that might be 0.2 points or something.
Right.
And so when the margins are so slim, when the difference between that late third and the mid second is kind of 52-48 between who actually finishes higher, guaranteeing that you can get something unique, which is not many people have that Jameer and Nico, so that if they actually both go off in week 17, that's a lot more likely for you to get to jump up the leaderboard than if Nico and London go. If Gibbs and London go, and actually 20% of the field has that combo.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. What do you think of sort of the wide receiver meta, I guess I would call it at this point, with prices the way they are? I know when you won BBM, things were totally different from a market standpoint. Do you think that people have taken 0RB/hero RB too far? Or do you think that this is sort of the way that it should be, and this is the way that people should have been drafting maybe for the last few years?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting what the landscape looked like when I did win it back 4 or so years ago. I've been known as kind of the hyper fragile RB bro because when I did win that BBM, also a lot of my portfolio that year was tons of this hyper fragile. And I went heavy into that strategy because, hey, I'll draft 4 rounds. I'll do it in the 4 RBs in the first 9 or 10 rounds. But I knew I could get guys like Garrett Wilson in the 11th or 12th round. You had wide receivers that were available in those early double digits that had substantial upside. So I'm not giving up hey, this wide receiver big hits by only focusing the running backs early on. That doesn't exist anymore. Even Jamar Chase, when he was a rookie, we were lucky he was falling to the 6th round because he couldn't catch because the balls with the stripes and stuff. Yeah. But now you've got Marvin Harrison going literally at the end of the first round. And then what? You look at Rome Odunze, you look at Brian Thomas, also the 3rd, 4th best wide receiver prospects, early and mid first rounders. And they're the number 3 options on their team, if not number even 4, depending on what you want to argue. But they're still going so much earlier. They're still going in the 7th round now? If this was 4 years ago, those guys are going 11th, 12th, 13th round. And so it'd be more feasible to say, I'm going to focus on getting some elite QB, elite tight end, a little more running backs early because I know I can get those wide receivers. That doesn't exist now. So now, yes, wide receivers are expensive as they've ever been, but you kind of got to pay the toll. You got to say I'm going to, if you miss out on it, you can do your zigging and zagging, but if you miss out on the wide receiver early, it's just really hard to get that firepower and make up for it with quantity and that depth later on.
Yeah, I think the consistent answer to this has basically been what you just said, where it's what else are you going to do, man? There are all these wide receivers flying off the board. You can't just not do that because you're going to be stuck without good wide receivers, which are obviously important for these builds. And then the other thing that I think that at least I've noticed is that you can also think of it as the one position that will not fall in drafts is usually wide receiver. Not many people are going to find, a Rome Odunze, let's say, or someone in that 6th round range just fall to the 8th. It just doesn't happen. Whereas, Rachaad White was in the 4th round, a month ago, and now you can get him in the early 7th often. It's not uncommon for something like that to happen. So these other positions are falling a lot more. So if you're really trying to just gobble up value, good luck doing it at wide receiver at this point because everyone freaking loves these wide receivers. But if you are going with sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you wanted to do the zig versus zag because you're everyone's going wide there's a smart way to do it. Go with wide receiver with your first 3 picks and then wait a whole bunch. Now
Yeah.
you've still invested heavily at the wide receiver when other people are, and you're not really missing ground. And now in the 4th, 5th, 6th round, you can get an elite QB, an elite tight end, a pretty strong running back, and you're kind of taking that zigzag method where it's like, hey, I don't want to just go crazy at wide receiver. Those 3 that you've drafted in the first 3 rounds are probably really solid. Now, maybe later on, you can grab a Cortland Sutton, you can grab a stack partner, someone that maybe they don't have the greatest medium, but they have maybe a weekly upside. Maybe with the rest of your 4 or 5 that you're going to grab later on, you can piecemeal together 1 or 2 kind of weekly spots. But that's where you can get unique without just kind of throwing your hands up and saying, I'm just not going for wide receivers.
Yeah, it seems like you can get unique too with what we talked about earlier with the pairings that you get, right? Where if you understand your tiers and, let's just say that you're in round 5 or something and, things have shifted a little bit, but let's just say that hypothetically you had Terry McLaurin, Jaden Reed, and Marquise Brown all in the same tier. Maybe you also have Calvin Ridley in the same tier. Why not reach a little bit for Calvin Ridley, get a little bit of a differentiation there with where you're drafting him, knowing that the difference between Ridley to McLaurin, in your eyes, this is just all hypothetical, is not that significant. Why not just sort of switch things up and just get different pairings than other people might not get? That's at least something that I've at least tried to do. It just goes back to what you're talking about earlier with the pairings in the first 2 rounds. I think you could hypothetically just do that, and you should do that throughout your draft to get a little bit different of a lineup. But if you are going with more of a 0 RB build, then the obvious question is, which running backs are you then gravitating towards? I mean, I'm assuming that you're still getting some in the early rounds at times. It's not like every single build that you're doing is just all wide receiver, 4 or 5 wide receivers through the first 5 or 6 rounds. I'm sure that you're getting, a running back here and there, but it seems like all of these running backs really get pushed into that round 7, round 8 range. And then all of a sudden you get running back city from round 7 and 8 to round 10 or so, where there's just not, number one, there's not many viable wide receivers left. And you don't really want to reach for like a Khalil Shakir or something like that. But meanwhile, you have these running backs who, some of them profile as bell cows. Like some of them actually have decent volume projections. So my question to you is, who are some of those running backs in that RB20 to RB35 range that you seem to be targeting a lot?
Yeah, and I mean, as you said, you've got like 2 profiles, I would say, in this group. You've got the bell cows that we expect to have meh efficiency and their teams aren't great. That's the Devin Singletary, the Jonathan Brooks. Or you get the ones that have the ambiguity. They have a little more concern, high risk on like what their actual role is, but they're on these awesome offenses that really could break out, or at least they have great roles. And so for me, I love leaning into the ambiguity. So the first one that I'll go, I'm going to just go by backfield. I'm going to go Steelers backfield. Arthur Smith is heading over. Now, in fantasy world, we hear Arthur Smith, we climb under our desk, we're scared, we have nitro, like terrors. It's bad. But from a rushing standpoint, we actually really like Arthur Smith. And I get it. Drake London, Kyle Pitts, you have the scars. But from a rushing game, and even Bijan, people are scarred, but you still had really strong years from Tyler Algier and Bijan. And so with Tennessee, when Arthur Smith was there, they had the 2nd and 3rd most rushing yards. With Atlanta, his last 2 years, they had the 3rd and the 9th most rushing yards. And just about every single running back that's been underneath him has had a positive EPA as well as success rate. He schemes very well for the running backs, and there's no reason to believe that's not going to be the case for Pittsburgh. So make it Najee, make it Jaylen, make it Najee, make it Jaylen. I'm happy with both. So that's kind of the first backfield I would throw out.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. That's the fact that I think the Najee stuff is sort of a post-hype situation too, where a lot of people were off of him last year, and because his cost was kind of it was in that 3rd round, 4th round range, and then all of a sudden, you have a player who's now really doesn't profile that much differently than he did a year ago, and he's going 5 rounds later, so it's really easy to go after that player. What are you doing with the Cincinnati backfield? Do you feel similarly about them as you would with the Steelers backfield, where maybe the run game isn't going to be as efficient, but Cincinnati's offense is probably going to be top 10 this year, you would imagine?
Yeah, and so Bengals, great example as well. I want to embrace that ambiguity. In best ball, we're not playing for the median outcomes. Finishing 3rd in your pod is the same as finishing last. We want to build teams that win your pods and are set up for substantial upside come playoffs. And most likely in Cincinnati, one of these 2 guys is going to be the primary back on an elite Bengals offense. And when I'm right, I've got a guy that probably should have been going in the 4th, 5th round. If I'm wrong, it's a 10th round. It's not that actual painful. And you know what? Turns out that team probably wasn't even going to advance out of your pot anyways, because it's hard to do that. But we're playing for the upside scenarios. And so when I think of like, hey, Zach Moss, is he really that much different than we had out of Joe Mixon last year? Like, I think the difference is not from much of the talent perspective, but, and even they're probably going to still use one of these backs as kind of that still Joe Mixon type. It's just, we have confusion. Is it going to be Zach Moss? Is it going to be Chase Brown? Who's going to rise there? I don't expect them to just go to kind of a 60, 40, 55, 45 split. I think one of them will kind of rise. Chase Brown has the higher talent, but less track record. Zach Moss was the one they brought in. Feels a bit more the kind of norm, feels more the kind of goal line back. So I like both of those. I'm willing to invest in both. And I'll throw one more out there as well. So I mean, I like from the Steelers, I continue to do these themes of kind of ambiguous backfields. And there's no bigger ambiguous backfield than the Broncos. I mean, right now you kind of have 5 running backs that could legitimately be there. Maybe Samaje Perine gets cut. That goes down to 4. One's a UDFA. We won't even bring him up. So like most likely it's probably going to be some combo of Javonte Williams, Audric Estime, and then Julian McLaughlin. But what's important with this backfield, I mean, let's start with the opportunity. So this team, we know they're going to throw to their running backs a ton, and they do it efficiently. Last year, they led the league with it was 33% of targets to running backs was leading the league. And those running backs were schemed effectively. They had great yards after catch for a yards per route run metric. All 3 finished in the top 12 of the league. You had, I think it was Samaje was first, Jaleel McLaughlin was 6th, and I think it was Javonte was right there at 12 as well. So you've got these running backs that are catching a ton of passes, are doing it out in space efficiently, and like it makes sense. This wasn't just like a 1-year outlier. It's Sean Payton. We've seen it all the years that he's done it before with Alvin Kamara and other backs. And then he goes and drafts Bo Nix. And Bo Nix is the king of kind of the short dumps off the screens. Like everything is setting up that like there's going to be a ton of, and especially PPR, but we still like to have PPR value from pass catching running backs. The question becomes who's going to play what role, and we really don't know. And that's why there's such, at such a cheap price, all 3 of these guys. But for me and my money, you've got Javonte. He was the elite prospect. He was the 2nd round draft talent. I know it was a previous coaching staff, but he's coming off an extra year on the torn ACL. So we like that health aspect. And if someone is going to become like a workhorse, going to get the lion's share of that backfield, I believe it will be Javonte. Yes, there's substantial risk. There's recent tweets out that actually Audric Estime may get kind of 40% of the touches. We're not really sure. But if this works out, this could be a huge slam dunk. If it's not, like all that risk is already baked in at the 10th, 11th round price tag. I think his ADP is like 105, 110, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, look, you might still get usable weeks from Javonte if they do split it way more than we would want them to, or if Estime gets a lot more work, on early downs than we want them to. The stuff with Sean Payton is very, very real. One of the craziest stats that I found all offseason was that when you look at the top 20 team running back target shares since 2011, Sean Payton's teams own 8 of the top 20. Which is just like mind blowing. This isn't just a personnel thing. It's not like Alvin Kamara was with Sean Payton this entire tenure. I mean, he's gone through, we saw guys like Pierre Thomas be really relevant in the Sean Payton offense. We obviously saw Darren Sproles for a while. Now, we get this new group where, we might see 4 running backs on that, like make that team. I don't know if 4 will dress every week. It's not usually what we see from teams, but like even still, I do think throwing darts at that backfield makes a ton of sense because it is so cheap. When it comes to elite tight ends, I've been saying it all along. I think that tight end seems to be the position that might make or break some folks this year if they feel very strongly one way or the other. But have you found yourself going more elite tight end this year? We'll call elite tight end everyone up to like George Kittle, right? Like where we at least know the Kittle weekly upside is crazy. And then, he'll go in like that round 6 range, but we're talking Mark Andrews, Trey McBride, Kelsey, Laporta, etc. and Kincaid. Have you been going after those players, or have you found yourself sort of getting more of the 3 tight end build, maybe getting like a Freiermuth and then 2 more guys that are complete dart throws late?
Yeah, so historically, I've leaned more into the late tight end strategy in Underdog because it's a position that's the easiest for a late round player to really break into that kind of top 5 or even, way even easier in the 10 scoring. And like in 2021, 3 of the top 6 tight ends were late round picks. Dalton Schultz, Dawson Knox, Rob Gronkowski. In 2022, 2 of the top 6 were late round picks. Taysom Hill, Evan Ingram. Then last year, the number 1 tight end was a late round pick with Sam Laporta. So there's a lot of validity and reasons for historically why I've kind of leaned into that kind of late tight end strategy. But this year, I just don't like the tight ends that are going late. And I really like the price and the upside of the ones that are going earlier. And so, you combine the upside that, hey, late run tight ends, they're more likely to be on the field compared to who's available, the running backs and wide receivers. Like, everything makes sense for why those late round tight ends kind of have that kind of breakout potential. But we don't have the rookies this year. The sophomores that we do have are going far higher. And so I think this is a year that I've really changed my tune. And I'm just more likely, hey, those top 7 tight ends, they have elite weekly upside. They're being drafted at discounted prices in my mind. A couple of them are going after the wide receivers. Like, if you want to grab the Ingram and Kittle, and the gap in my mind between like Ingram and Kittle and then your Goddard, your Njoku, I think that's a substantial gap that, like, I want to really, hey, try to grab one of those early 7. Or I'm making sure that I'm stacking with that next tier, with Bowers being the outlier, where I think Bowers is just the rare case where, like, his median is substantially lower than where he's being drafted, but it's still great to get kind of, I'd say, exposure in your portfolio because of the talent and the upside that kind of goes there.
Yeah. With the early tight ends, and I've been trying to go elite tight end more. It's really easy to build 3 tight end like, just wait and just get these guys late, and you'll feel really good at running back and wide receiver and such. Especially because if you're not going elite tight end, you're probably going elite quarterback. But regardless, the thing that I've kind of been going back to is, seems like these tight ends are being drafted in round 4, round 5. Because of projection, where, we're looking at like what Kelsey did last year, and we're afraid that maybe, he's on the downturn of his career, or like Mark Andrews, sort of the same deal, where we didn't really see it as much last season. But to me, it's like, these guys clearly are the players who would have that hypothetical, like when we look back or looking into next season, would be a late first, early second round pick, right? Like, these are the players who at least have that upside. I think that what we all need to separate ourselves, or what I've had to separate myself from, is that, like, not all these guys are going to hit. We know that. Trey McBride might not hit. Sam Laporta might not hit. But it does feel like maybe 2 or 3 of these guys will end up hitting and being, worthwhile enough at their cost, worthwhile enough if they were even in the mid-third, early third. And that's pretty significant at the end of the day, especially when, like you said, feels like there just aren't many obvious late round tight ends this year. It's very, very difficult to find those guys. Whereas last year we had that influx of talent, and it just seemed like it was a little bit easier to go with those players.
Yeah, I mean, I want people to sell me on which late tight ends they could see breakouts out of, because it's really difficult. I mean, the fun names are Noah Fant. Hey, new contract, you get rid of Disley, you get rid of the other tight end, but like, he's still best case number 4 pass catching option on a run first team. Then you get Chig. Okay, Titans, Brian Callahan comes in. They're going to throw more, offensive line improved. Yeah, but they still have DeAndre Hopkins. They still have Calvin Ridley. They still have Tyler Boyd. They have 2 pass-catching running backs. Like, there's just not going to be much volume there. I can run through all the names, but normally, historically, like, I told myself a story on Jake Ferguson. You can sell yourself a story on Sam Laporta. It's just so gross this year at the very end.
Yeah, I totally agree. Is there a particular strategy, just in general, just an item this year that you think just isn't being talked about enough within the space?
Yeah, I would say, so for me, and it's one that I've been kind of heavy on the past couple of years, so people know it, but drafting 2 RBs in the same team. And, historically, people are like, I don't want to handcuff my running backs. I especially don't want to do it in best ball because I'm supposed to draft like I'm right. So if I grab the first running back, why am I going to grab the second? I've got to draft like I'm right. But we've done some analysis and seen that, like, there's a lot of value to drafting multiple running backs in the same team, especially when it's in an ambiguous situation, because there is some correlation aspects throughout here. First is you're making a bet on that team as a whole, and specifically that the run game is effective. And so you can have scenarios where both actually overproduce their outcomes if you're getting values because it's an ambiguous situation. you can get where one of them gets hurt for a period of time and the other now rises to a substantially better pick. And maybe actually you get some ping pong throughout the season as well, or maybe even in the playoffs where last year, Raheem Mostert, Devon Achane, like a great example where 1 week one goes off, 1 week the other goes off. And having them together gives you actually some additional contrarian value in the playoffs, because if you needed one to advance in the pods, but then the next week, the other guy probably isn't as owned there. So you get that kind of upside there. Now, this doesn't mean that, hey, if you go draft, let's see, what's a good example? Bijan Robinson, that you should go grab Tyler Algier. Because in those scenarios, you've been drafted so much capital at that first one, you really do need Bijan to be the world beater and have that elite season. But the ones we talked about, the Steelers, the Broncos, the Bengals, the Cowboys, those are all examples where like, hey, you're making a bet on that run game with an efficiency, and both those could outproduce. And when we ran the data, we saw that, hey, even in seasons where one guy really went off, there's still value to kind of having them both from those intermittent spike weeks, the larger kind of correlation across the season, and the value in the playoffs.
It's amazing that you brought that up, because that's something that I've thought about, haven't dug into / talked to anyone about, because in season long, which is obviously the perspective that I'm coming from, in season long, it's just not easy or optimal to really do that, because you're having to then choose and figure out which one of those guys. It's just a massive headache, and it's annoying, and you're burning that roster spot in trying to figure that out. But to your point, obviously if you had like Mostert and Achane last year in season long, that's fine. But I do think that the idea of injury, if you do hit on that backfield, is really interesting. Think about like even Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery last year, which, obviously a little bit more capital than what you're talking about with some of these backfields. But even then, like both of them were fine standalone, right? When both of them were healthy, but then they each had their own little pockets of being injured. And when they were injured, the other guy was an RB1 in fantasy. And I do think that the key here is probably the point of differentiation in the playoffs, which is not something I really thought about much. I would assume, I don't know if you guys have run the numbers, but I would assume that most teams are not doing this. Like most teams are generally avoiding doing something like that. And so if you have that, then there's a point of differentiation for your lineup right there.
Yeah, I'll throw it from, I think it was 2 years ago, conversation was between Michael Leone and my colleagues at ETR. And then he put out analysis article on that. I think it's just titled, Should You Handcuff RBs in Best Ball Mania? I think it's free to see, so feel free to check that out. But it does actually go down to how often teams are doing it, what the value is of doing it, which ones it kind of works best with, and so on.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So speaking of these these playoff weeks, are you a heavy week 17 game stacker? Number one, that's the first question. But then the second question, are you concerned at all about week 15, week 16, especially now that there's a little bit flatter payout structure? Things are a little bit different where you don't necessarily, I mean, obviously we want first, but not getting first, there's not as big of a cost as there was, say, last year. And so just kind of getting there, getting to the dance, and then, placing fairly well instead of extremely well can still give you that payout. But are you very, very focused on week 17 still? And while you're drafting, are you paying attention to those week 15 and week 16 matchups, or do you just not care that much?
Yeah, so for me, still very heavily on the week 17. I consider it a core part of my strategy, but not something I am giving up other facets of the draft to get that week 17. Meaning, I don't want to reach a ton just to get week 17 correlation. I am not valuing a week 17 bring back more than a primary stack partner. I am not going to give up my roster construction or my draft capital just to get that week 17. All that said, though, there still is value in playing for that week 17 and getting the bring backs for your stacks and get the mini stacks for that week 17. For week 15 and week 16, I'm not going to say you shouldn't be doing it, but like it's so small down on what I'm prioritizing that it's not just something that I'm really caring about. And there's also even arguments saying that, hey, if you build for week 16 and then you get the guys that go off in week 16, you now have a higher owned guy in week 17. So maybe there's actually some value of like, hey, the best way to really get to week 17 is to kind of squeak in there with a more unique lineup. I don't know. End of the day, I'm not making a strong argument for or against, but there's just a lot more important things that I'd be recommending people focus on than trying to start going into week 16, week 15.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. we talked about this a little bit earlier. I feel like we could have talked about this when we talked about it, but the stuff about information and having the information that we have here in June versus what we're going to know in July and August as we learn more. One of those situations that we could have thrown out there was the wide receiver situation in San Francisco, where every day there's a new rumor about Brandon Ayuk or Deebo Samuel leaving the team. And so my question to you is, have you been drafting them any differently, or have you not cared because you're not entering BBM as heavily right now, where things could drastically change in July and August?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I will say is post NFL draft, it's pretty rare that we have major trades. So I think that like the chance of a trade now is pretty slim, and I wouldn't really be incorporating it into my draft strategy because more often you're just going to be going after a red herring and it's just not worth it. But if you wanted to say, no, you know what? No, I've actually got a pretty strong feeling. I've got a lean that like something was going to happen and either Ayuk or Deebo is going to get traded. If anything, you should then build out like hey, what are the possibilities if this works? The player that gets traded probably is going to go down in ADP because they're going to leave San Francisco. Sure, there's a chance that like Ayuk goes to Buffalo and like you can build out that perfect scenario. But there's a lot more risk there. But what we do know is if Deebo or Ayuk left, the other one is moving up the draft boards to probably early second round. I mean, Deebo as the number one wide receiver option without Ayuk as a target earner, and if he's actually getting more volume without there, Kittle is probably even the sneaky substantial booster there as well. If we're going to say like, hey, he's actually going to be a regular part of this passing game and move up to the number two option. So I mean, you always want to think through like, hey, what are the downstream implications there? But for me personally, if it's regarding trades, I think it's pretty slim that we see any major trades this far into the offseason.
Yeah, I feel that's a really good point because I feel like there's a negativity bias that we kind of approach these things with, where we just think about how bad it would be for Brandon Ayuk going to Pittsburgh or something like that. But we're not thinking about how good it would be for Deebo Samuel this season if Brandon Ayuk were gone. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe there's a little bit of risk in drafting them just in general, because what if you are a little bit heavier on Ayuk and then Ayuk is the one who gets dealt? But number one, as you said, trades don't often, big trades especially, don't often go down, post-draft. But also, you could just be getting both of these guys at an equal exposure, and then the other guy really blows up, and then all of a sudden those teams, have that edge. So I like thinking about it that way, and that's a way that I, for whatever reason, I think it's just the negativity bias of our brains. I'm just like not as focused on that side. Before I let you go, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
And if you want to remove the trade aspect, we can still think about this as contingency upside. Because the same argument for Ayuk or Deebo leaving is Ayuk or Deebo get hurt. And then what happens to the other? And if we think about like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of another wide receiver that's an area. Okay, let's go Malik Neighbors. There's no one that can get hurt on the Giants that increases Malik Neighbors' kind of role and upside in that offense. Maybe Daniel Jones would be the only one, but that's tongue in cheek. But if we look at San Francisco, if Ayuk or Deebo get hurt, like, now we actually have contingency upside. And later on in the draft, good example would be Cortland Sutton versus trying to think of another wide receiver in that area. But like we'll do the Rome that beats Brian Thomas, even though they're a little earlier on. But the idea is like Cortland Sutton, there's nothing he can do to actually increase from a contingency upside to get more targets, to get more volume. Things just have to really work out that like, hey, Bo Nix is actually good and the offense is great. But if you look at Rome or Brian Thomas, one wide receiver injury, an Evan Ingram injury, now those guys can have substantially more upside. And we think of a contingency upside often with the running back position, but you can do it with wide receiver. And you can even stack wide receivers. If there's three guys on Houston, on Jacksonville, on Chicago, and you want to draft two, that third one gets hurt. Both those two have major boosts. And now you're getting some correlation there with the contingency upside.
Yeah, I mean, that's the number one reason why you can't just draft off of projections, right? Like projections, especially like Houston and best ball, Houston or Chicago or even San Francisco, it's like, yeah, like these guys might not have a projection that lists them where their ADP is, but we're also recognizing that number one, they can have these spiked weeks, even with, look at Houston. Tank Dell can have a spiked week even with Stephon Diggs and Nico Collins being there. But also, what happens if one of those guys gets injured? What happens if one of those guys are out? Then all of a sudden, it's wheels up and they could hypothetically have, two wide receiver ones within that offense. That's a really, really good call out to make. I'm gonna end this with one more question. I want to know 2 or 3 players right now that you seem to be getting most frequently so far this year.
Okay. Well, so if you just listened to the past half hour, you probably could have picked up on a lot of those because those running backs that I talked about, there's a lot of those. We talked about my tight ends, but like names that I'll say the Rome and the Brian Thomas are definitely ones that we just mentioned, but I'm really excited about because of first round talents, third and fourth best wide receivers in this draft, both on strong offenses that I think are going to be ticking upward, and both have substantial contingency upside as well as playing their way into larger roles and peaking as the season goes on, given the rookies and kind of the talent. So big on that. Two people that I would say we didn't mention but are pretty similar. Let's go with Elijah Mitchell and CEH. When we're at the end of drafts, right now, we've got to make some tough decisions. You can either kind of say like, hey, I'm going for the tight ends because you're going with the late 3 tight end strategy, and you can find a couple tight ends that at least be out there. Wide receivers, you can try to correlate with your QB. There's definitely some value in that. But when we're looking at running back and you're like, I just need a couple more running backs, there are very few out there that have this level of upside in the offense. You've got Kansas City and San Francisco, two of the top offenses. This much clarity that they have the number 2 role. There's minimal competition for Elijah Mitchell and CEH for that number 2 spot. And we've seen with both teams when the number 1 goes down, both of these just kind of, as long as they're healthy, move directly right into that role at maybe, I was going to say 80% production. CEH is probably 80% production of Pacheco. Obviously, Elijah's not of CMC, but we've still seen from a touchdown efficiency and what they can do on the ground, like both, especially Elijah Mitchell, both those still have substantial upside, just one injury away. And it is really hard to find that level of security and clarity in the backfield for a strong team with any other running backs going in the end of drafts.
Yeah, in full circle, especially right now as we draft, right? Like we might learn more. We probably will learn more in July and August where there is some more clarity as to who you should be drafting in round 17 and 18. But right now, let's just go with the old reliables. Although calling CEH an old reliable is probably a little bit too much. But anyway, Justin, thank you so much for hopping on and talking ball a little bit. Can you let everyone know where they can find you and the stuff that you're working on?
Yeah, for sure. So name is at Justin Herzig. You can find me on Twitter. Do all my stuff at Establish the Run. And JJ, appreciate the invite. Always love doing these shows with you. And hope you have a great best ball bro summer.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I'm trying to. As always, you can find all my stuff over on lateround.com. Check out that draft guide and pre-order it. That'll be out on July 1st. But otherwise, everyone, thank you for tuning in.